Okay, welcome everybody. I apologize for the size of the room. That's all we could do for some reason. So the Organizational Theory and Information Systems group is really excited to welcome Steve Barley. And so I'm going to introduce Steve and then introduce the paper a little bit, if that's okay. My name is Virginia Lovell. I'm an assistant professor in the Organizational Theory and Information Systems group. Okay, so Steve Barley, you guys probably already know this, but so he's the distinguished Professor Emeritus from UC Santa Barbara's Technology Management Department. He's also Emeritus from Stanford. And so before UCSB, he spent 10 years at Cornell's School of Labor Relations. And then he was at Stanford for 22 years. Steve was the editor at ASQ from 1993 to 97, and then the founding editor of the Stanford Social Innovation Review from 2002 to 2004. Steve has written over 100 articles on work and technological change. And I think just pointing out one or two books that kind of predate this paper today is that he co-authored with Gideon Kunda Gurus, Hired Guns, and Warm Bodies, Itinerant Experts in the Knowledge Economy, about contingent work among engineers and software developers. And then his most recent book is from Oxford University Press called Work and Technological Change. And so the paper that Steve's going to present today, I asked him to present this paper basically for two reasons. One is that this paper is about ideology. And so I think among people who are studying work and technological change, we're learning a lot about how work is changing and how even exploitation is changing with algorithmic control and surveillance and kind of all the new technological phenomena. But I think this paper really draws from, in many ways, the kind of founding of labor process theory with Harry Braverman and David Noble, where it really interrogates ideology. Because a lot of the changes that we observe in our research is really made possible, or at least goes down easier with the help of changing ideology around work. And so this paper really interrogates that, and I really wanted him to talk about it because I think we need more of it. And then second, I thought it would be a really interesting paper to have us discuss at a business school. Because in many ways, I think the things that Steve talks about in the paper, business schools are in some ways part of the scene of the crime. And so in this paper, it's his most recent paper, and you can read it in Research on the Sociology of Organizations from 2022. And I know Steve is okay with you guys jumping in and asking questions along the way. So
yeah, that's fine.
Turn it over to Steve.
Right. Okay. So first off, let me say how honored I am to be here, and honored by all of your attendance. I know that people, even Fariel is here. We worked together at Cornell. Stanford, sorry. I'm so pleased that, you all came. I hope I live up to your expectations. What I'm going to do today, as most of you may know mostly my work on technology and work and organizations. But I actually have had a couple of other streams of work, my research, right, that I've done over time, and these are the three that I've done. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the intersection between work and employment. And employment has been a long-standing interest of mine, but particularly it's sort of why I went to the ILR school at Cornell for 10 years, as well as ideology and rhetorics. Now, you might ask the question, why would you want to study rhetorics as opposed to, say, social structure? And my answer to this is twofold. The first is how people talk about things shapes how they see them, and how they see them will affect their actions. And this includes people who design technologies and deploy technologies. So, for example, with artificial intelligence, it's not surprising, to me anyway, that many of the people who are promoting the diffusion of AI at the moment justify it in terms of how much more efficient and effective they're going to make workers in various occupations. The secondary argument around this is the one I really believe, is that it's going to further the elimination of employment in our societies. And that really concerns me. And that kind of concern underwrites what I'm going to be talking about today, even though I won't be talking about that directly. The second reason that I think rhetoric is important, and I'll flip back between the words ideology and rhetoric, is because rhetorics or ideologies are used to legitimize institutions and institutional changes. And this is very much at the core of what I want to talk about today, because I'll be talking about changing institutions of employment over a period of time running from roughly the end of the Great Depression until today. Now, I co-authored this paper with Bob Eberhardt, who is at the University of San Diego now, and with Andrew Nelson, whom many of you probably recently heard because he was here giving a talk. Andrew was my student at Stanford, and Bob was also a student at Stanford, but did not work directly with me. They're experts at entrepreneurship as it's normally thought about. I am not. I'm a dilettante in this field, but I think that I have something that is worth considering. So we're going to take our cue today from Reinhard Bendix's book that discusses managerial ideologies and employment relations, and we're going to attempt to extend his argument into the modern era. Bendix published Work and Authority in Industry in 1956. I see this book as one of the most important books in organization studies, but I think very few people read it today. And I would encourage you, if you haven't read it, to read it, because particularly if you like history. If you like history, this is a history of ideological thought over time. The book is an exegesis of how people in authority, now from the landed gentry and to the early industrialists, through to corporate top management and managerial theorists of the human relations era in the 20th century. He argues that people in authority in all of these various eras mustered ideas to frame their right to control people who work for them. First, then second, why those people, those workers, should accept their lot in life, and in fact, why they would even owe their allegiance to the people in control. So that's generally the overarching thesis of this book, and he plays it out through historical periods set first primarily in the UK. So there's a lot of discussion in this book about managerial thought and justifications of various kinds of labor, from using people from poorhouses, right, to staff your firms, all through the human relations movement. So he focuses on the UK, he focuses on the US, and he focuses on the Soviet Union, and I don't think the Soviet Union part is, at least from my perspective, all that important. So I'm more in line with the UK, US tradition in what I'm going to be saying today. When I teach courses in work and technology and employment, I almost always tell I make my graduate students read this. And I always tell them, it's time for someone to extend Bendix's argument into the present. And Gideon and I tried to do a little of this in a paper we published some years ago, like maybe a lot of years ago, called Design and Devotion, where we look at the shift back and forth between rational rhetorics and normative rhetorics of control in organizations. But we didn't really focus so much on the history of the progressions of this, like Bendix did, because we had other fish we wanted to fry at that point in time. So in 2020, Bob, who had taken one of my doctoral course in which I have them read this book, said he would like to work on extending the argument. And I said, okay, I'll join you. And we then invited Andrew to join us. and hence the three authors of this paper. I want to make really clear that we are not talking about entrepreneurship as the act of founding firms, or the way that most people who study entrepreneurship study it and talk about it. We're coming at it from almost a perpendicular angle. Our claim is that rhetorics of entrepreneurship have been appropriated over the last 3 decades, at least in the US. Now you can tell me whether this is true in the UK or not. And in fact, what I'd like to know as we go along in this lecture is how much of this fits for here and how much of it doesn't. So over the last 3 decades, to justify and legitimize the rise of insecure employment, specifically, particularly in the United States. Let me give you 2 examples. The first example is a company called Arise Incorporated. Arise contracts with individuals, Arise contractors, who then in turn contract with other contractors. So we've got 3 tiers here, in order to provide service, in order to answer service calls from firms out here who have contracted with Arise to have these folks down at this 3rd tier of the hierarchy answer questions about whatever technology or service the company the client company pushes. The clients include Comcast, Disney, Airbnb, Intuit, and Apple, and there's many, many more, right? Now, here's what Arise claims about its employment model. Oops, that's Bendix. We don't need that anymore. Okay, I forgot it. Our platform offers unique opportunities to entrepreneurs and business owners in the United States, Canada, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. By providing access to work-from-home opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available to them and connecting them with companies that need customer support, for entrepreneurs, and then blah, 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 for entrepreneurs, Arise provides immediate access to a pool of potential customers. Okay? So we can think about what all this means, right? It means that these people, these folks down in the bottom, right, are the entrepreneurs. And we're going to try to answer the question, do people like that really do see themselves in this way? But there's no doubt that firms who are employing these folks use this terminology. And if you know anything about employment relations in Britain, right, you'll recognize this as essentially the putting out system that was used in early days of industrialization in France and particularly the UK, where merchants would buy raw goods, raw materials, and then distribute those raw materials to people in their homes who would then spin yarn or weave or make shoes and a variety of other products. And then the merchants would go around to the houses, take what had been produced and take them out and sell them. So this is a putting out system. It's important to understand that this is a revival of a 200 to 300 year old system that dates back to pre-industrialization. The second example I want to give you is Proposition 22. Now, the first thing you need to know the background you need to understand is that in California and a number of other states, I don't know whether you have propositions here, but in California, if you get enough signatures, you can put a proposition on the ballot. And if enough people vote for the proposition, then that becomes state law. Now, what Proposition 22 was an attempt by Lyft, Grubhub, Uber, and other gig companies to not have to pay the cost of permanent employment by classifying gig workers as independent contractors. So what does this mean from a firm's perspective? First off, in not particular ranked order, right? They would never have to pay overtime. No matter how long a person works, you don't get paid overtime. 2, you no longer have to provide health care insurance like regular employers in the United States do. Now this is very important because you guys are much more advanced society than we are, because you actually have a national health service, and no matter how bad you think it is, right, it is not as bad as not having any health service. And the Republicans in the United States are now trying to reduce the opportunities for health care to underemployed and unemployed people. At the moment, I mean, this is one of the screwed up debates that are happening in Washington right now. Third, the company does not have to pay any retirement accounts because they're independent contractors, they're not employees. In the States, most companies will no longer provide pensions, but they will contribute to 403Bs and 403Ks, which are defined contribution plans as opposed to defined benefit plans. 4, the employer has to pay no employment taxes. All employment taxes are assumed by the individual. 5, you do not have to provide drivers for Uber or Lyft or any other gig sharing economy firm with tools, including cars. So the gig drivers are expected to buy their own cars and maintain them. Now this is not totally new. FedEx is like this. FedEx drivers are independent contractors. They have to buy their own trucks. But they are required to paint them in a particular way. And there was a lawsuit about them back in the early 2000s, and I'm sorry to say FedEx won. So gig companies like Uber and Lyft sponsored this proposition. In fact, they sponsored it to the tune of $200 million in advertising to convince citizens to vote in favor of Proposition 22. They argued that gig workers are entrepreneurs willing to accept the risks of precarious employment in exchange for independence and flexibility. So to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, let me see if I can get this to play for you.
Lyft started as a new way to earn a little extra, open and available to people from all walks of life. That flexibility gives drivers the independence other jobs can't offer. Prop 22 will give them that and more. They'll get guaranteed earnings, healthcare benefits, personal protections, and they can maintain their flexible schedules. But if drivers are forced to become employees, up to 90% of app-based driving jobs could disappear, and the jobs that are left wouldn't have the flexibility they need. There would be set shifts, flat wages, and limits on when and where they could drive. That's why the vast majority of drivers, by a 4-to-1 margin, want to maintain their independence. Protecting their flexibility and providing historic new benefits are what we're fighting for. Vote yes on Prop 22 to help create a better path forward for drivers.
All right, now, just out of curiosity, what did you see? What did that clip say to you? What were they trying to say to you? Healthcare, it's a lie. It's a lie, right? Healthcare, they don't provide healthcare except to a very small percentage of their drivers. The vast majority of them do not get it. They don't provide secure employment. But they don't say that. Okay, they talk about, what do they talk about? Flexibility and independence. Now, independence is a word that Americans hold to be next to God. Right? So Man, you tell people that this is going to give you independence, and people are going to jump over top of it. And on top of that, they say if you don't do this, all these people are going to lose their jobs. Well, of course, which is not true either, unless the company goes out of business because it suddenly has to pay more than it used to pay for the employees or for the workers they do have. So a large number of gig workers did vote yes. And on top of that, the majority of Californians voted yes. Even though the opposition ran ads on TV too. They didn't have as much money, but they ran ads. And more importantly, most of the newspapers and TV newscasts in California explain what gig workers had to really lose if Prop 22 passed. But it did indeed pass. So there are various explanations for why gig workers would want to vote for a proposition that, if they thought about it, right, would make their lives worse off than they might otherwise be. Now, there's a number of these explanations, and one of them is that workers really value flexibility, right? And you can't get that out of a standard job easily. But if you look at Leslie Cameron's work on Uber drivers, or Hadam Rahman's work on Upwork, which is a platform-based employment system for more highly skilled people, or the work that Gideon and I did on high-skilled contractors, what you would find is that workers don't get the flexibility they desire. In fact, I have a paper with Gideon and Evans in ASQ about why they don't get the temporal flexibility. And the answer is, bottom line is the bottom line, right? Once I get addicted to getting money, right, I want to maximize my income. So I start working more and more and more hours. The other thing that's really interesting about these high-tech contractors, and by the way, most of these people had master's degrees or better, was they didn't put any money away for retirement. So 44% of the tech people who were contractors that we interviewed did not have retirement accounts of any kind, including a significant savings account. So you can see where this form, because you can see where you become, how would we put this? Making money leads you to want to make more money, right? And time is money, right? So as time becomes equated with money, you work more hours to get more money. Now, what we're about to argue, Bob and Andrew and Spirit and me, is that the rhetoric of entrepreneurship was gradually co-opted to legitimate the undermining, or at least sidestepping, the institutions of employment security in the United States that flow out of legislation that was passed during the New Deal. And the New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt's policies, which included labor policies that were about, for example, Social Security as part of the New Deal. So the story I'm going to tell you is going to backwards. How do I do that? The plot of the story I'm going to tell you goes like this. Act 1. What was the institutionalized system of employment relations between the end of World War II and the election of Ronald Reagan? The second act is a short act. It's about how the system was dismantled, beginning in the 1980s and running through the 2000s. The third act is what we're going to call the rehabilitation of entrepreneurs. And you'll get the notion of why rehabilitation when I use that in the Soviet sense, after starting in the 1980s. And finally, the last act is how the rhetoric of entrepreneurship merges with the rhetoric of employability. That is, you're responsible for your own attractiveness to employers, and how those two have been joined to justify sidestepping traditional employment relations in the U.S. So let me stop there and ask you if you've got any questions, because you're not talking enough.
And I was thinking, we're not talking enough, but I'm really deeply curious if Prop 22, it's not just in California.
No, it is just in California. It is just in California.
No, Prop 22 is only relevant to California, but the other 49 states and the rest of the world doesn't, as I understand it. This is a question, not a statement. How does it work in the other states?
It works this way. The difference is,
and why?
California is, from an American perspective, extremely progressive. And the state legislature looked at these Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and said, you guys are getting screwed, right? So we're going to pass a series of laws that force Uber and Lyft and Grubhub and whatever, right, to pay a living wage, which in California at the current time means $15 an hour, regardless, right? Lyft and Uber and the other gig economy firms that rely on contractors said, whoa, this is really going to cut into our profits. And so they raised enough signatures to put Prop 22 on the ballot. Now, this has not occurred in other states, in part because there are a whole bunch of states, particularly in the middle of the United States, that would never think about this as a problem. And then the other states that might, which are largely in New England, just have never brought it up yet as a legislative issue. But, so that's why, California. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments? Disagreements?
Well, just one question, just following up on that, Steve. So if California is indeed progressive, then how did they vote against the legislatures?
I'm sorry, how did what?
So they voted against this, right?
Mm-hmm.
They did not, yeah. And so if California is indeed progressive,
Why would you vote for this? Right, right. Well, that's exactly the core question of this whole talk, right? Why would guys vote for this? Now, we've already posed one answer to that, just based on this Lyft commercial, right? Is that they're promising you flexibility, right? Now, if you are a young married couple with children, right, flexibility sounds really good, right? Except you never get to use it that way if our research, the Gideon's and my research is right? Secondly, like I said, independence, right? This is like mom, this is like God, this is like apple pie in the United States, right? And so people will look at this, particularly if they don't know what independent contracting means, and I suspect there's large portions of the California population that don't know the legal differences between a full-time, an employee and a contractor. So they look at what's being said. And by the way, I didn't show you commercials where contractors, they literally have contractors up there saying, don't take this flexibility away from us, right? So there are a lot of people who are not well informed about what this law really means that vote for it because it sounds like the American thing to do. That's why. Yeah, Monique.
This may be a little bit of a question early on from time, but I wonder how global is the story you're going to present? So the case of Prop 22, I was thinking in my mind that I compare it to the case in the UK when Deliveroo drivers took Deliveroo to court in London about self-employment status, and eventually they didn't get it in the end, so they are considered self-employed, very similar to Prop 22. You see similar things in Asia around things like DD, a lot of the shopping apps as well. So I feel like the 4th point is something the rhetoric with entrepreneurship you're seeing globally, but I'm wondering how much of your story is seen through a global lens.
Well, not very much because, what I'm focusing on is what went on in the U.S. But I am, in fact, aware that it's going on other places. Arise, for example, is talking about Irish and the UK, right? So it's very clear that they have at least established themselves in Great Britain. And so I think it's really quite common. But the theoretical thrust of the argument that I'm trying to make today is, I think, transnational. And it has to do with the slow but inevitable, or inevitable is not the right word, relentless spread of neo-institutional thinking.
And I guess the question I'm asking as you're telling the story is this US and we've been kind of, spread out, or has this kind of come up individually? And I guess
I can't tell you because I don't know. I'd have to, for the UK, I'd have to look at the history. So maybe you guys should have a better sense of that than I do. Yeah.
You're probably getting this, Steve, but what's the link of rhetoric and ideology then in your story?
Oh, the link between rhetoric, I see them as equivalent terms. I see them as equivalent terms. Rhetoric is a term that I would use because I was an English major. Ideology is a term that I would use because I became a sociologist.
And again, you may get to this, but this feels a bit like a case of framing an argument in such a way that it can't be disagreed with, right? So I'm reminded
Totally.
of Arlo Hochschild's
Totally.
Stranger in Her Own Land.
Yes.
Where she goes to Louisiana over a period of 5 years, and you'll know the story, but
Right.
finds out that these are people that consistently vote against their own interests.
Right. That's exactly right.
They're voting against policies that could prevent industries from polluting the waters.
Right. Right.
And it's not that they're dumb. They kind of know they've sussed out the fact that they're
Right.
worse off now than they used to be.
They know that, and
There's
they.
something they care about more, which is freedom from interference. Right.
Right.
And so,
Right.
in some ways, it's probably partly a matter of how you frame.
It's
the argument.
that I couldn't agree with you more. This is, if you're writing from the framing literature, this would be a story about a frame, except in this case, the frame is about an entire system of employment relations. So it's not a frame within one particular organization, or a frame within one particular occupation, or even a frame within one social world, or at least a small social world. This is a frame that spreads across an entire economic system. Yeah, Paul.
Linked to what Mark was saying, was there a counter movement that you studied that had its own rhetoric or its own?
A counter movement.
Yeah, so we did an alternative rhetoric already.
Well, the counter movement is called unions, right? And as I'll show you soon, right, the number of Americans who are now members of unions has dropped precipitously since the 50s. Yes, Susan.
The counter movement that I've come across, maybe, and I'm interested in your take on this, might be FIRE, so financial independence, retire early. And so they see themselves doing what they do in relation to precarious employment and use it as part of their justification for whatever they need to do as a kind of, I've heard it called solo entrepreneurship. But
Yeah. Solo entrepreneurs, right. Well, we're going there. That's exactly where we're headed. That's the rhetoric, what I will call the rhetoric of employability and free agency.
Yeah.
Okay?
So would that be a counter movement for you?
No, it's consistent with this. It's quite consistent with this. In fact, it is the source of the ideology that supports this.
The pension part's different,
Yeah, the pension part's different.
So financially structurally, it's quite different.
Well, in the United States, it's not. This is a rhetoric that also, and you'll see some of the rhetoric in a moment, right? That pushes the entire responsibility for employment and security onto the individual, right? All right, so let me pick up the story and start with what was the age of security as Americans understand it. This is a term that comes out of industrial labor relations. Sometimes they call this the traditional employment bargain, but I've come to the conclusion that it was only traditional from 1940 to about 1980. And the more you look at, it's consistent with Piketty's argument, right, about what happens when societies start to withdraw essentially democratic socialistic security arrangements across the labor force and other places like healthcare. So after World War II, in the wake of Franklin Roosevelt's labor policies, Americans enjoyed this era of the age of security. And the terms that mark this are the following, right? What is the age of security? Deal is employers would provide employees with long-term jobs, and hence careers. You know. Opportunities for promotion, what's what I mean by a career. The literature in labor relations would be focused on internal labor markets. Pensions for retirement, and in this period of time it really was pensions, defined benefit plans. Health insurance for employees, and for Americans this is really crucial. And the training necessary to build human capital that's relevant to the firm. In return, workers pledged sustained effort over their career, commitment and loyalty to the firm. And this was backed up by employment law and collective bargaining and the ethos of employment during that particular period of time. The actors, the organizational actors here, were two or large corporations and unions. I don't know whether you follow Mark Mizrachi's work. Mark Mizrachi has written an incredibly important book that he just published a second edition of, right, where he points out empirically how top management of American corporations bought into this idea of the security for loyalty bargain. And in fact, at that period of time, the top managers of corporations like GE, GM, so on, right, were tolerant of unions. In fact, essentially there was a negotiated labor peace brought about by laws that established terms for collective bargaining. But things start to change in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan and the increasing control of Republicans over the legal lawmaking bodies in the United States. So now we're to part two, the demise of the age of security. So between 1973 and 2019, the percent of Americans employed by large U.S. corporations, and by this I mean large corporations listed on the stock exchange, right, fell from 43% to 29% of non-farm employment in the United States. Between 55 and 24, union membership fell from 33% to 10% in the United States, and the vast majority of that 10% until 6 months ago were government employees. During this period of time, Michael Jensen and other finance people reinvigorated or established the shareholder vision of the firm. And I'm sure you know that that meant firms exist to make their stockholders wealthy, and they do not owe anything, really, to either society or to their workers. As Peter Capelli noted, of the 500 companies on the Fortune list of top manufacturers in 1980, 1/3 had experienced a hostile takeover by the end of the decade, and 1/3 no longer existed as independent entities. Now, this is a direct upshot of the spread of shareholder stockholder, the development of corporate raiders in the 1980s. So this theory of the shareholder view of the firm, right, which was backed by the Chicago economists, who in turn controlled at least American economics and government thought about economic systems for a very long time. Firms began to treat labor as a variable rather than a fixed cost. Now, this is very different than what it was like when I was, did my PhD in 1979 to 84. And at that time, we were teaching people in MIT's business school that labor was a fixed cost. By the end of the decade of the 80s, right, it's conceptually people have been convinced that labor should be a variable cost. which means you can raise it or you can lower it as you wish, right? With demand. During this time, for the first time, when there were layoffs, managers were laid off and not hired back. This was a big change. It's also the era where firms began to offshore work in the United States, and I'm sure that's happened here too. Offshore work in increasing amounts. And in addition to offshoring, which hit the manufacturing industries really hard, and hence the basis, as I see it, for many of the political problems we have right now in the United States. It also is true that over time, with the emergence of the internet, very important, allowed the beginning of offshoring of white-collar jobs. Because with internet-based computational technologies, right, you can move information in PowerPoint slides and, Excel spreadsheets and all kinds of stuff, and have conversations with people face-to-face through Zoom now and whatever, right? This is an infrastructural technology for this kind of shift in the nature of employment. So, and then finally, during this period of time, we come to the 1990s, and that's when contingent employment begins to take off. So by the early 1990s, 95% of all American companies used contingent workers. Some percentage of their labor force was contingent. By the most narrow definition of contingent work, by which I mean people who are placed through staffing agencies, people who are who register as independent contractors, and people who are placed in the word is escaping me. Substitute teachers, right? That kind of employment relationship. You get 11 from 1990 to 2015. You see contract work grow from 11% of the workforce to 16% of the workforce. Now, 16% of the workforce is about 4 or 5 times the number of farmers in the United States. Right? So that gives you some sense of what this means. And if you use looser definitions of contingent work, which would include part-time workers, for example, which I don't think you should do because a lot of part-time workers get the same kind of benefits as full-time workers. But if you use it, we're talking somewhere between 30 and 40% of the American labor force. In fact, employers stopped even promising any kind of continued employment to workers. And here's what, don't need that anyway. Here's what Apple was telling its employees in the mid-1990s. Here's the deal. Here's the deal. Here's what we want from you. We're going to give you a really neat trip. Notice the psychedelic language, right? A really neat trip while you're here, right? Because historically the Silicon Valley was staffed by, or was formed by a kind of merger of hippie culture, counterculture, and cyber culture. And Fred Turner has a great book on this topic of how these two subcultures mesh together to form the Silicon Valley. But anyway, we're going to teach you stuff you couldn't learn anywhere else. In return, we expect you to work like hell. Buy the vision as long as you're here. We are not interested in employing you for a lifetime. That's not the way we are thinking about this. It's a good opportunity for both of us that is probably limited, not finite. So this is the kind of stuff that firms, particularly in the Silicon Valley, are starting to give their employees. Now, let's turn to Act 3. the rehabilitation of entrepreneurs. It's important to remember that by the mid-20th century, at least in the United States, the economy was dominated by large corporations, professional managers, and labor unions. So we've said this, right? The glamour of entrepreneurs, which had existed during the Gilded Age, right, had faded, in part because the progressives, and that's what they called themselves, Teddy Roosevelt was one, managed to pass a series of laws that the Sherman that attacked trusts and conglomerations on the basis of unfair market practices, and hence split up firms. And what began to happen is these entrepreneurs were replaced by full-time managers, so that by the middle of the century, we look back at people like Carnegie or Vanderbilt or Mellon or Leland Stanford, and we call them robber barons and tycoons, right? And as William White wrote in The Organization Man, and which is a book I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It also was published in '56 by chance, which lays out the ethos of what it was like to work in large American corporations at the time. Wrote this: the entrepreneur, as many see him, is a selfish type motivated by greed. And Margaret Graham, whose work you might or might not know, is a well-respected business historian, concurs with William White. And she writes, for much of the rest of the century, that is after the 1920s, the term entrepreneur took on a negative connotation, signifying the eccentric individual who was all too likely to be disruptive of the well-integrated organization. Now, who might these disruptive types be? Here's one, John DeLorean. Now, some of you are too young to probably remember John DeLorean. But you could see from the picture that this guy does not look like the typical GE top manager of the day. And the typical top manager at GE did not have a partner like this, right? But what DeLorean did was develop the DeLorean, which is the automobile sitting beside him, and it was put out by the DeLorean Motor Company. He established a firm, and it was a really cool car. It had gull wings, right? No other car had gull wings at this point in time. But the problem was, and this is consistent with him being kind of the corporate rebel, he had trouble getting enough funding for the DeLorean Motor Company. So he decides to make the money by buying and selling large numbers of kilos of cocaine. And he gets busted. It turns out that he tried to buy some cocaine from an FBI agent. Not particularly good move on DeLorean's part, but fortunately he got off because his lawyers were able to argue that he had been set up by the feds. And anyway, the latter half of the 20th century witnessed a rehabilitation of the entrepreneur from being a tycoon or being someone that disrupts organizations. Because during the 1960s and 1970s, and you can tell me whether I say this right because I always have trouble with French words, the Mont Pelerin Society, is that how you say this? It's close enough, okay. You know, as an American, I screw up stuff all the time. Literally resuscitated Schumpeter's work. And Schumpeter, of course, claimed that innovations championed by entrepreneurs were the economy's engine of growth. Now, why did the Mont Pelerin Society do this? The Mont Pelerin Society, if you know anything about them, included Hayek and ultimately included Milton Friedman, were dead set against socialism. They looked at what had happened in the Soviet Union in 1918. They looked at what was going on in the United States with the New Deal. They looked at the kind of policies that were rising in Great Britain, and in fact in France and most other European countries after the war, and said, we've got to stop this. We need to stop, and we need to booster hardcore laissez-faire capitalism. And part of this was the role of the entrepreneur in the rejuvenating capitalistic economies. So, beginning in the 1980s, governments began to buy into this argument about entrepreneurs. And so they began to develop policies and programs to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. And a bunch of us in this room, including me, right, teach courses on entrepreneurship and innovation, right, because of this stream of thinking that began in the 1950s with the Mont Pelerin Society. In the 1980s, a new industry arose that we call venture capital. Right? And if you ever were in the, like Fariel and I, if you ever teach at Stanford, you are like flooded with entrepreneurialism, venture capital talk. It's just incredible. And one reason I'm glad to be out. So between 1978 and 2020, venture capital funds in the United States grew from 1 billion to 74.5 billion. And I remember being at MIT in the early 80s when the biotech industry was just taking off. And if you know anything about venture capital history, biotech was one of the first places where venture capital really started to put money in Genentech and Biogen and so on and so forth. And I remember venture capitalists coming to MIT to talk to us, and none of the people in the business school really understood what venture capital was. So you need to see venture capital as a new industry that is in fact predicated on stimulating and taking of entrepreneurship and making money off of successful entrepreneurs. Do you guys get money from the Kauffman Foundation? Do you know what the Kauffman Foundation is? The Kauffman Foundation currently in the United States is one of the biggest funders of entrepreneur research and training. The Kauffman Foundation started off as, the Kauffman family started it off as a foundation to improve education in Kansas City, Missouri. But in 1992, it shifted its agenda to promoting entrepreneurship and has since then become the primary funder, as I said, of entrepreneurship education and entrepreneurial research in the United States. During the same period of time, the number of universities teaching courses in entrepreneurship grew between the late 1960s and 2003, which is the last year I've got data for this, from four universities in 1960 taught courses in entrepreneurship. By 2003, 1,600 universities taught entrepreneurship. And of course, then there was the popular press. The popular press gave increasing attention over time to entrepreneurship. Founders again became cultural heroes. Business gurus like Peter Drucker, who had once championed the human relations movement and the idea that corporations were communities and that corporations owed things to their employees, began to shift his perspective to hail entrepreneurship as the cure for bureaucracy's ills. In fact, by 2005, the influential labor economist, Edward Lazer, who also happened to be at Stanford, summarized the shift. And what he said is, the entrepreneur is the single most important player in the modern economy.
Yeah, so I thought English maybe you would appreciate this, but I wonder if the missing link so far in the argument is the work of Ayn Rand, the Atlas Shrugged, where
Oh yeah, Ayn Rand, right, yeah.
which is a very, very lucid philosophical justification for exactly remaining in the higher.
Well, certainly it is the case that Ayn Rand and libertarianism is rampant in the Silicon Valley.
She made the ideas accessible.
That's exactly right. She did. She made it accessible. She made the ideas of Schumpeter and the Montpellier Society accessible to the average person. They were best-selling novels, right? They were the basis for libertarian movement. And the Silicon Valley is chock full of libertarians. And when you hear what the gurus or the entrepreneurial heroes are saying in the Silicon Valley, you better believe they were influenced by Ayn Rand. In fact, when I first went to the Silicon Valley, I had an East Coast perspective, right? And the East Coast perspective was, God, these guys are really socialistic, right? You get to do anything you want, right? They don't suppress human differences. I thought they were liberals. When I got there after maybe 5 or 6 years, I realized that this was not what I thought it was. This was libertarianism. Libertarianism says, yeah, basically you can do personally anything you want, but let's keep government really small. Let's keep government out of our everyday lives. And so you're absolutely right. Ayn Rand was really important, and I didn't bring her in here because I really wanted to focus more on what was happening structurally in society at this point. Now, one way of getting a handle on the cultural importance of large corporations in the economy and entrepreneurship in the economy is to turn to Google Ngrams. Now, Ngrams, if you don't know them, are the percentage of books that use certain words. And because Google has digitized so many books, you can get pictures of trends through time. So here's the percentage of mentions of corporations. And what you can clearly see is there's a peak in the way people talk about corporations sometime between 1930 and 1950, and from there on out, a decline, which becomes much steeper in the early 2000s. Another way of looking at this is what's the percentage of mentions of the word entrepreneur or entrepreneurs in books published, and this is what it looks like. So clearly, the shift at least is carried in the popular language. Now, there are two major themes in this popular language. The first is the lionization of entrepreneurs. We're talking Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, Sergey Brin, Elon Musk, right? All these heroes of American culture. And the rise of TV shows like, I understand it's called Dragon's Den here. It's called Shark Tank in the United States, right? And these are shows that glorify venture capital and entrepreneurship. So what begins to happen is the Kauffman Foundation starts to publish reports that glorify entrepreneurship. And in 1910, they produced this report where they claim that without startups, there would be no net job growth in the United States. No net job growth. It turns out that this was not a peer review publication. Therefore, was not subjected to the kind of methodological critiques that our papers are supposed to be subjected to. And it turns out also that there was a reanalysis of this data. And the authors of that reanalysis, who were respected academics and economists, had this to say. While startups contribute substantially to jobs immediately, most startups fail, or even if they survive, do not grow. While a small fraction of high-growth young firms contribute disproportionately to job creation in the United States, think Google, these findings pose challenges to policymakers seeking to promote job creation by encouraging entrepreneurship. Because most young and small businesses are not, in fact, primary creators of jobs. And continued research shows this. So now let's move to the employability rhetoric and how it fuses with entrepreneurship to create the, yeah, Monique.
It was just a background. One of the things is, how much was it also a product of the use of the word entrepreneur, because what we meant by entrepreneur changed.
I can't tell that because I haven't done.
But just thinking about, like, for example, even when I started studying entrepreneurship 10 years ago, we talked a lot more about small, medium enterprise.
Right.
And actually, you would find papers that actually used it interchangeably.
Right. That's exactly right.
Enterprise, and actually, they weren't measuring entrepreneurship.
That's right.
They were measuring the number
That's
of
right.
small firms, which, that changed the definition. And now the fact, starting from even your example right at the beginning, where, I think, Avon ladies back in the day would not have referred to themselves as
But now they will.
But now they do.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You're totally onto it. And in fact, there's a large literature on what rightfully should be called an entrepreneur, and or an entrepreneurial firm, and of course you're probably quite familiar with that. Jen.
So this might be a sideways point, but I'm thinking, I don't think you're claiming that it's the rise of this rhetoric around entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism that is the only explanation of what filled the gap, right?
Oh no, this is about legitimation.
Okay.
This is about legitimation of an institutional change. I don't think the rhetoric caused the institutional change. I think the rhetoric legitimizes it, and to the degree it's successful, right, broad swaths of the population buy into the way the rhetoric is constructed.
Okay, so that's important, right? But I'm just curious if there are other things going on, again rhetorically, that further legitimate. So, for example, I'm just reminded. I'm just casting my head back to this time, and in my first faculty job, my colleague Tim Hall wrote a book called The Protean Career.
Right.
And which was all about how wonderful it was. This was circa early 2000s. How amazing it was that we didn't need to call ourselves entrepreneurs, right? But we had this wonderful opportunity to reinvent our career over time.
Right.
We no longer had loyalty or commitment.
Right. Exactly.
Training that
Totally
was
right.
by
You're
being
totally
tied to
right.
a single firm or even a single role. So there was a really, and I'm probably, like, Tim's a nice guy, and like that's great work. But the point is, there's just an example of there's a career-focused literature being put out there to tell people, even if you're in a corporation, isn't this fantastic that you're not going to have loyalty with more corporation?
Exactly. And in fact, at the same time that Tim's talking to you, you probably remember Mike Arthur, right? Mike Arthur, who was from Sussex, right? In the U.S., not from here, right? And he wrote a book called The Boundaryless Career.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the same idea, right? So you're actually right. There are career researchers who are contributing to this way of thinking from the academic literature.
Yeah. But so I guess all I'm saying is entrepreneurship isn't carrying the full burden of legitimizing this shift in how we
That's right.
employment relations.
That's right.
Potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. But I'm focusing on entrepreneurship here because. But if I read my paper, I talk about Arthur. I don't mention Hall. I don't mention Tim.
Yeah.
But at any rate, right?
Yeah.
Let's turn this to this rhetoric, right? And how the structural developments that I'll get you in a moment, where we're going to go. The structural developments that I've been talking about were accompanied by a new rhetoric of employment that lay the groundwork for justifying the gig economy and work as independent contractors. Camille.
No, it's really interesting, and as usual. So that's nothing new. But what is fascinating for me is that you started out by describing the general sort of environment in California, in the U.S., and so forth. And the UK is very different in the sense that we have strong unions.
Yes.
And we also sort of have employment. So there's a new bill that is in Parliament that is actually it's already effective, the Employment Rights Bill, and so we are already in the process of sort of all the casual workers will be given employment contracts and so on and so forth. So So that's, it's going in a different direction in one sense.
Thank God.
But the legitimation of entrepreneurship is exactly the same.
I just hope to God you
as
don't.
the US.
I hope to God you don't get a Donald Trump.
And I could take it to a more extreme example, which is the Norwegian example, where it's the only country probably where 10 years ago when they came to Norway, and I was doing my master's, I worked for Foodora, and it's been the only example where the workers unionized and they managed to get a collective agreement.
Right, right.
But then again, at this point, after 30 years, I think the battle is lost. So precisely because of this, and even though this system clashes completely with the institution of welfare in Norway, right?
That's exactly right.
But still,
it's still happening.
They are taking advantage of people who don't know how Norway works.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I think that all Western societies are wrestling with this to one degree or the other, right? In this particular instance, the U.S. case is really instructive because it shows you how far things can go. Right? So anyway, back to the emergence of the rhetoric. In the 1990s is when this idea gelled, the rhetoric gelled around the concept of a free agency. And Daniel Pink wrote a book in 2000, well, actually, his first version was in the 90s, and then he released a new version in 2001. But what he argued was we should be a nation of free agents. And notice how he changes the subtitle from America's New Independent Workers, or how America's New Independent Workers are transforming the way we live, to the future of working for yourself. Now, Pink wasn't the only one. By the way, Pink was the speechwriter for Gore during the Clinton administration. And somehow I don't really, Clinton bought into this too. But at any rate, it wasn't the only book. There were a surge of books. The first one actually that was published that was big was Job Shift by William Bridges. But then you get all of these, Tom Peters moves from corporate culture to writing about the brand You Incorporated, the startup of You, creating You and Company, how to brand yourself, right? Even if this is so popular during the 1990s and the first couple decades of the 21st century, that Gene, I want to rock and roll all night and party every day, Simmons gets into the game too. You all know who who Kiss is, right? Okay. That's Gene Simmons without his makeup, right? And he writes a book called Me Inc. Build an Army of One, Unleash Your Inner Rock God, and Win in a Life of Business. I couldn't help but put Gene Simmons in the talk. What an idiot. At any rate, the rhetoric of free agency literally said this: liberate yourself from paternalistic corporations and the conditions of the traditional employment bargain. Don't seek security. Refashion yourself as an entrepreneur or a consultant or an independent contractor and proceed as if you were your own firm. Dan Pink put it this way: this loyalty for security compact forms the foundation of corporate paternalism. What could we hate worse than paternalism? Right? The notion that corporations are families turned out to be at best an outdated promise, and at worst an outright charade. I see that as an attack on all the corporate culture research that was done in the 1980s. It's almost as if Ma and Pa Corporation, their mortgage payments increasing, their futures bleak, looked around one day and saw a bunch of 19-year-olds flopped on the family couch, watching reruns and munching corn chips. This hurts us a lot more than it hurts you, they said. Now get out of the house. To which kids, chastened into candor, replied, fine. I've always thought this place sucked anyway. For American worker, adolescence was over, adulthood and free agency had begun. Well, that's what Pink had to say. There are 4 primary themes that reverberate throughout all of these manifestos. The first is the theme of individualism and freedom, portrayed as sources of power against the corporation. So here's what Simon Calkin, who's a British business journalist, had to say, published in an American journal. At the bottom, the trade of loyalty for security was unsustainable and exploitative. By tying their career and skills to one employee, and this is Arthur and Tim Hall, by tying their career to one employee, they sacrificed mobility and market value in return for a promise that couldn't be kept. By contrast, the emerging New Deal, important way of framing it, the very mobility of career-independent employees provides powerful incentives to companies to keep their promises. Right. The most important of which is to provide interesting, motivating work. Otherwise, these valuable staff members will leave. So the death of the security of loyalty contract has made room for a more durable and satisfying employment relationship, this time based on independence rather than employer paternalism of the past. The second theme, or at least leitmotif, is the appropriation of the language of finance to argue about why this is the way we should go. And what was the appropriation of the language of finance? Planning a career is often compared to investing in the stock market. The stocks are your skills and experience, and they're called in this literature assets. Kaufman and Reid Kaufman, who founded LinkedIn, he refers to skills and experience as assets. Pink argued free agents should diversify those assets, right, across a portfolio, literally a portfolio of skills, in order to hedge their bets. They literally say, hedge your bets in the economy. So like with the literature on entrepreneurs themselves, this literature of employability argues that individuals should shoulder the risk of employment, and hence you will reap rewards just like entrepreneurs who establish firms. The third theme is you've got to learn to accept failure. And you need to pivot when you do fail. So here's what Reid Hoffman has to say about this. How do you know when to pivot from plan A, what you're doing now, to plan B? You'll rarely know for sure. In general, a lesson from the technology industry is that it's better to be in front of a big change than to be behind it. Of course, expect both good luck and bad luck along the way that will open and close unexpected windows of opportunity. And then, Gene Simmons says basically the same kind of thing. I won't go through Gene's stuff. Gardner, at Stanford, there's something called the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. And every week or so it invites an entrepreneur to come in and talk about how they founded their firm and how they were successful. So these two researchers, Gardner and Ingram, analyzed 87 of the talks that were given to STVP students. And what they discovered was that in most of these talks, eventually the speaker would get around to saying something like, learn from your mistakes, pivot, and do it again, iterate, and pivot. Okay. Now, I can't imagine the blue-collar guys that I knew when I grew up being able to do much pivoting because there aren't many employers, and they aren't mobile, right? So this is a bunch of gilded rhetoric for most Americans. So, the final, all this stuff sums up. I don't want to forget, employers disappear in these arguments and reappear as clients and customers. So, here's what Bridges had to say about this. In a market, people don't have bosses and supervisors, right? In a market, one has customers, and the relationship between a supplier and a customer is fundamentally non-organizational because it's between two independent entities. According to the market paradigm, one's boss is really a major customer rather than an authority in the old sense. In a market, resources can be underemployed, but since there are no jobs to hold, unemployment in our sense is a meaningless term. A meaningless term. This is, I don't want to be there yet. Okay, so let's back up and keep it there for a minute. No, this is where I want it to be. And Bridges says much the same thing. Oh, is this the same one I just said? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read it. Okay, never mind. Sorry. This notion of employability among academics was pushed by Rosabeth Kanter. I don't know whether you remember reading her books from the late 80s. She didn't just write Men and Women of Corporation. She wrote a number of later management books that focused on just the need to do this, just like Mike Arthur and Tim Hall did. So all this sums up to a statement about what constitutes employability. And I'm about done here. First, individuals must ensure that they remain employable. It's their job to remain employable. Second, failure to do so is your own fault, not anybody else's. Employment reduces to a purely economic transaction. 4, customers owe, customers, that is the firms, owe the free agent coordination and pay for the agent's skills and time, but only for the duration of the engagement. And in return, the free agent owes the customer accountability and nothing else. So what evidence do we have that gig workers, independent contractors take this rhetoric to heart, that they believe it, or at least they give lip service to it? To date, there have been no surveys of what gig workers and independent contractors and so on think. If you're looking for a dissertation in employment relations, this would be a decent discipline, and you're not afraid of survey research, this would be a decent dissertation because no one's answered this question. But what we can do is look to the ethnographies that have been done of gig workers and independent contractors to look for what the ethnographers uncovered that workers have said about the way they see their jobs. So I want to show you a couple of those. Gina Neff, who is somehow attached to Cambridge, isn't she? She still is, right? Gina studied web designers in what was known at the time as New York's Silicon Alley. Silicon Alley has kind of met its demise more or less since then. But here her data are full of people who bought into this rhetoric, and here's one of them. This is Sam, what's his name? Gina writes, Sam looked for what he thought every stock investor would look for in a company, literally comparing his choice of job to a stock investment. For any company that he worked for, he should be more than happy to invest money and buy their stock. Sam, like many in Silicon Alley, had an individual level explanation for managing the risks he faced. In his worldview, each individual is responsible for managing risks. Some jobs are more expendable than others, and therefore they might be at a higher risk. It's really up to you to manage that risk, to take precautions. Build up savings, what is psychologically and financially necessary to handle that risk. Here's what Steve Vallis and his co-author Cummins, who studied personal branding among people who had lost their jobs and among career coaches, had to say. And this is a specialist in educational technology who had lost the job. This is what this person has to say. You have to practice it, a branding pitch, all the time. You have to practice it every day. Even when you're at the grocery store. If someone you know, if it's someone you know, you turn around and you tell them your branding statement. You tell them, because a lot of people will say, I didn't know you did that. I didn't know that was you. And oh my gosh, so-and-so works at such and such. And it can lead you right into that job opportunity. A final example I'll pull from Gideon's in my work. This is a high-tech contractor who says the following. Permanent employees think they have job security. They don't. In fact, they have practically no job security, especially in California, where you can be fired whenever the company likes. Job security is the ability to get a job. Permanent employees don't have job security because they don't have the networks. They can't call someone and get a job tomorrow morning. They think they have job security, but it's on paper. Real job security is when you have a network of managers and recruiters where you can simply call them and say, okay, my contract finished, and they say, great, I can place you somewhere tomorrow morning. That's where you have real job security. You're able to get a job. So to summarize all this, let me say that let me try to summarize this, and I'll do it by reading because I want to make sure I say what I want to say. The ideology of entrepreneurship has been enrolled to promote broad social acceptance of an employment system that does not, in fact, work for many Americans. Of course, employers still exist, and from a structural point of view, they retain the upper hand. The rhetoric of employability and entrepreneurship justifies employers treating labor as a variable cost. It also allows workers to claim that they are, allows employers to claim that they are providing workers with something many people desire: flexibility, the opportunity to shape their own present and future. The rhetoric of employability and entrepreneurship obscures the long-standing dichotomies between rich and poor, authority versus subject, boss versus worker. It camouflages the distinction between those who have the right to control and those who must obey. The ideologies of human relations and organizational culture did this too by emphasizing cooperation and collective orientation, and by claiming that workers and managers were all members of the same family and community. But the developments in the 80s and 90s undercut the image of the collective family such that it was no longer as viable as had been in the past. By combining a market-oriented imagery of vendors and customers with the notion that individuals have the power to shape their own destiny by developing skills and brands that will ensure prosperity, fusing the ideology of entrepreneurship with the notion of employability obscures the fact that those doing the hiring still possess most of the power in the employment relationship. That's it. Thank you very much. And for that, I'll open the floor to anybody who wants to say anything, differ with me or whatever, right? And I'm going to sit on the table and hope it doesn't break. Come on.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. It's super interesting. So in a way, coming back to my earlier question, if you look at the U.S., right? I mean, it's very easy to sort of see, how you painted the picture. Because if you look at the overall economy and where American capitalism has been going, there has been greater joblessness and underemployment and precarity and so on and so forth. So it's almost seems inevitable that such a rhetoric, would emerge around entrepreneurship. It's kind of like how business schools, categorize their students who can't find jobs as entrepreneurs, right? In rankings,
right?
And so on. So. But there are also institutions that are missing on the American side across the pond. I mean, we were talking about it yesterday in the context of what was happening on American campuses, because they don't have UUK that we do, which is the Union of Universities, 140 universities across the UK, who lies with the government on behalf of the university. They don't have a professors union. Professors
well, some do, but most don't.
Yeah, so private universities don't. Really, I mean, so have the kind of union that we would call union. And here in the UK, what we see of entrepreneurship, despite having strong institutions here. And despite having sort of this parallel raft of bills going through Parliament that provide better job security. So this becomes sort of more intriguing in the sense that, so two things in parallel. But on the other hand, one does see, so very, a few days before you arrived, the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, was forced out. And she was the main proponent for this employment rights bill that was coming.
For employment stability?
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
okay.
Employment rights bill, which means that, basically, casual workers have to be given employment contracts, and, they can ask for their jobs to be stabilized and so on and so forth. So, your research almost sort of shows us what we can expect in the future.
That's right. Danger, danger, Will Robinson.
That's right.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, Steve. Thank you. As before you gave your wonderfully articulate conclusion of your paper, I tried to kind of digest what you said in terms that made sense to me. So, if I get this right, at the heart of your presentation is the transfer of risk, which is legitimized by framing this transfer in terms of a societal value that one cannot disagree with,
Right.
which is given godlike status by academics, novelists, politicians, and rock stars.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I would say
So
that's right.
Here's the question.
As well as the transfer of responsibility, not just risk.
Yeah.
Right.
And things like belonging, identity.
Yep.
So here's the question that kind of ties to this. So if you were to substitute corporations in your presentation for business schools, given that no tenure still exists in many schools, but it's on the way out, and
Yep.
given that we tend to appropriate financial language in terms of talking about our publications and the market value of the people that we recruit and that go, is the translation perfect? And it's not perfect.
What's not perfect?
Parallel, I suppose.
Okay.
And the answer is probably no, it's not.
There's similarities
So
anyway.
there
Yeah.
are imperfections. And is what you said a sign of where we are going? Or in some ways it's what you say, just a different version of what academia has always been about?
I don't think it's a different version of what academia has always been about. I think that there was a period of time where scholarship was valued more highly than number of publications. I think there was certainly a time when there was competition between various academics in a particular field. We know enough about science to know that there's many, many instances of multiples and people taking each other's work and, but it wasn't about publications so much, right? This, as I see it, also begins to rise up after the Second World War. I don't think business schools are the only ones that play this new game about publications. I think that to the degree that economists usually have the dominant say in a business school, I think to the degree that that's true, this way of thinking about the value of publications is probably more prominent. I also think that it allows an easier or more efficient metric, right, for making decisions like promotion and tenure. But I don't think that it's always been that way. And if it had been that way, I would have probably dropped out of graduate school just because of who I am. But the game became that. When I was in graduate school, I didn't think about playing this kind of game. And most of the people at MIT then, and I don't know whether you would agree with this because you came a little later than me, but in the early 80s, Van Manen wasn't publishing in journals. Shine did occasionally. Lottie Balin did occasionally. But they were more likely to publish in books. They taught us that what was really important was the quality of your scholarship and not how, I mean, we didn't even know that people counted publications. You know, it wasn't until I got out beyond MIT, particularly moving through Cornell to Stanford, it wasn't really till I got to Stanford where the counts became really important. And it wasn't just the counts, it was how good was your last one. All right, so that's that ups the pressure a little bit more even, right? So it's not just how many, because you can have a lot, but if your last one really sucked, you know. Yes, Susan.
Just wondering whether you feel the similarity and differences with Ulrich Beck's individualization of risk and responsibility. I mean, that's quite
In academia?
No, in the topic of your domain of your talk.
Yeah.
Is there a parallel with Ulrich Beck's individualization? Focuses of individualization of risk and responsibility.
Well, I think what this is really about is how do you justify underemployment and unemployment. I think that's really ultimately what it's about. If you can push the responsibility for unemployment onto the unemployed and the underemployed, right, then you've succeeded in maintaining your power within the economic system. Now, this is exactly what British entrepreneurs and manufacturers did in the 17th, 18th century, right? They argued that the ability to get ahead was based upon, they would use different words, would be based upon your industry, right? Your diligence, right? They would add how much you drank to the equation. And they would then say, if you're an employee, if you do these other things, if you're diligent, if you're dedicated, if you don't drink your life away, you know, you can be one of us too. And that was the argument. And there were arguments about why you send people to alms poorhouses, about what you're going to do when you send them to a poorhouse is you're going to give them over to the religious guys. The religious guys are going to like teach you diligence, going to teach you responsibility, right? So that you can lift your way out of the poorhouses into a paying job. So if you push this rhetoric down to its really core, and this is what Bendix did, that if you go deep enough into these rhetorics, you find this common similarity about why these rhetorics are promulgated.
So I'm just thinking through the kind of bringing this to today, because it is really clear that people have been fed and bought, hook, line, and sinker, as they say, that they have agency and they can own, you know, they have independence, etc. However, I'm just reflecting on if you spoke to a new graduate today, and I'm definitely not an expert in AI, but has the agency argument crumbled in on itself in the sense that people want to, you know, I look at this and I think, okay, that was in the days where you had a network and you had a telephone. Right now you have LinkedIn, which has algorithms, and you're one of multiple, and you apply for a job and you have no idea whether anything or anyone will read your thing. And even my son, who works for a big American corporation, you know, where people have been there for 30 years, some of them, was applying for an internal job, an internal promotion in a slightly different group. He'd already spoke to the hiring manager, and I said, well, what happens next? He said, oh, well, obviously the next process is there's a one-way video interview. And I'm like, hold on a minute. It's an internal process, and they have you go talk to a screen and see if they like you.
You mean like what the cops do when they interrogate people?
Well, maybe not, but I don't know. I mean, this is life, right? Like I live it through my children. I don't get it because, you know, but there is no. So this guy's quote is really interesting, but that's a different era of what it meant to have agency in employment relations.
Yes. This is the early 2000s,
right now, have we fed people the line that they have agency, but the reality and the experience in the era of AI and hyper competition for employment and whatnot is that they expect to have agency and they have none. And then what?
Well-
like, all I'm saying is I think, like, this is great, but I think it's getting even worse, potentially.
Well, I agree with their conclusion. I think that if you read Arlie Hochschild's most recent book and her book before that, look at, the first book looks at what do the average worker who backed the Tea Party movement in the early 80s think is happening to them. And what, in their second book, has brought that forward in time, and she studies a dead coal mining town in West Virginia. What you find are the rhetoric that says, yes, you've screwed me, you've taken my jobs away. But what they don't do is focus on the corporations that have done this, and they don't do this in either book. Instead, they focus on the government, and they focus on immigrants. And they become more pissed off and more pissed off and more pissed off. And then a guy like Trump comes by. And he appeals specifically to this problem. And they say, well, yes, let's give it to him. And then that's what you wind up with, right? So I see the election of Trump as largely being the long-term consequences of these trends.
Yeah, I won't say I disagree.
H.A.
I'd like to actually try to respond to Jen's question. I did my dissertation data collection 9 years ago in Silicon Valley, and I did it in pharmaceutical coding boot camps. So the people there that I met totally bought into this philosophy that they had to invest in their own employability, and it was their job to take out a loan, pay for a private short-term education, a 3-month boot camp to reskill to get hired into a growing job domain, software engineering. Now, fast forward 9 years today, where you have AI taking over all the lower level technical jobs that these training programs were training people for. I don't know what answer I would get if I asked those same people, would you go into a private boot camp to do this kind of investment into your own reskilling? I was listening to a short video, like news from Financial Times, where someone was saying maybe people will have to pay for their own apprenticeships again, the way they did in the early 20th century, right? Because now companies have less and less incentive to invest in junior level hires, you know, the graduate job apocalypse, and maybe apprenticeships will be these, you know, hard to find thing where you have to pay to get in, and if your parents can pay, you basically get it. And you'll get some on-the-job training. So I don't know where we're heading really. And I think the change is happening right now. Because like I said, 9 years ago, this rhetoric still worked very much.
Yeah.
And
those jobs were there. I mean, they were.
Those jobs were there. And they were not long-term, but they were high-paying, you know, kinds of jobs that the people who buy into employability really wanted to get.
Okay.
But today it's a different world.
Yeah.
Unique.
I'd love to pick up and just kind of add to that in terms of from the entrepreneurship world, and we brought in Reid Hoffman. Is it Reid?
Yep, Reid, yeah.
And he was recently kind of interviewed about the whole work-life balance and how it's come from an entrepreneur, if they're interviewing an employee, the worst thing they can hear is someone asks about work-life balance, and I've heard that from many entrepreneurs. But also the fact that he was also saying, if you're being an entrepreneur, don't expect that work-life balance, particularly the early, you know. And he talks about when he was setting up LinkedIn, and he allowed his employees to go home for dinner, but then they were expected to clock in after dinner. So I kind of wonder how that sits with this flexibility thing, because there has always been that rhetoric within the entrepreneurship world of, you know, we're in it together, we're working hard, you know, we play at work, we play hard, yeah.
Well, that's pretty much what Gideon and I found in working with the high-tech contractors that we interviewed. You know, I said earlier that they one of their rhetorics was that it provides me with flexibility. So we interviewed them about how many, you know, what hours each day do you work? Do you work weekends? Do you share childcare if you have children? We call that short-term flexibility. And then we talked to them about long-term flexibility. The other rhetoric that surrounds this is, you know, you do a job, you succeed, you take some time off, It couldn't, and come back and maybe you use that to reskill yourself, or maybe you use that to just, sail the Caribbean, as one guy did, right? But when you look at whether or not they actually use this flexibility, you find that, I don't remember the percentages, a relatively low percentage use short-term flexibility, and a much larger percentage do not take advantage of long-term flexibility because they ultimately learn that their time is money and they can't bring themselves to stop working and they don't save. So of this group, right, like I said earlier, these are college-educated technical people, many of them with master's degrees. They have no savings accounts. They have no retirement accounts. Many of them wouldn't have health care if they weren't married to a spouse that worked for a corporation that provided the health care. So, yeah, it's like you don't have time.
I'm kind of intrigued that the rhetoric seems to have changed over time because it was discussed about this idea of flexibility, whereas now, they talk about, going out off for lunchtime and going surfing or, these kind of elements to it. Whereas now, that's gone and it's all about the you work hard kind of rhetoric. And I don't know whether that's just the power of the ideology and now they don't have to hide it.
I don't know. In order to see whether that's true or not, you also have to see what people are actually doing. So, yesterday I talked about why studying what people say and studying what people do are really important. You got to do them together, right? But what was happening here was no one was linking to, no one before us has tried to show how the ideology linked to the practices. Yes?
I saw a lot of the rhetoric peddling kind of, maybe dignity is not the right word, more like status as well. I don't know whether that was salient, but that seems to be a big thing.
I think that's totally true. Specific, if you look at the literature on branding, self-branding, that's totally true. Even if they don't do anything, it's how they brand themselves gives them, I don't know whether a real identity, but at least a faux identity. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned twice that these people, despite being well paid and highly educated, they don't own the savings accounts, they don't own the pensions. Did you dig into more why that's the case? Is that because they simply don't have enough money to put away into a savings account, or is it more a choice that they make, or do they buy products and services that allow them to work more? And then
I have a very simple explanation for this. When you go to work for a corporation and HR takes you in, right, the first thing HR does is sit down and tell you the rules. The second thing HR does is have you sign all the forms about whether or not you're going to take money out of your pay to put in a retirement account, how much. Some firms, many of the bigger firms will offer matches, so the more, at some point, the more you put in, the more they'll put it up to a ceiling, right? Now, think about what you've just done. You've sat down at one point in time and made a decision about the quality of your future. And you've made it, and now the organization is going to enact it for you, right? When you're a contractor, you get paid every week or every 2 weeks. You get paid in cash, right? You don't have anything you can take out. If you're going to save something, you have to decide that I'm going to put this much of my paycheck away for when I'm, 60, 70, right? Am I valuing what I'm going to be like at 70 and my quality, the quality of my life at 70, or relative to, boy, I sure would like to have that McLaren, right? And I can tell you that a lot of these guys choose McLarens, and this is why Lamborghini and McLaren and all of them have auto showrooms in the Silicon Valley, because when guys catch in, right, a lot of them go out and buy themselves really, really, really expensive fast cars, and other things like really, really expensive fast cars.
So this is really interesting talk, and I was wondering how this could be related to the movement of people and who's in the workforce and who isn't.
Ooh.
Because I was thinking that the lean in, the book that
Oh, yes.
Group.
Oh, yeah.
There was so much protest against it because it suggested that it's the one woman leaving in what we call the rhetoric.
Right.
Same sort of rhetoric. And then I was thinking about the Uber drivers that I've taken in the various countries I've lived in. They're often immigrants.
Yes.
And
That's
so
right.
it's the way in. So is there some story here about the movement of people, who gets to vote and who doesn't, and how political parties and vested interests otherwise?
I couldn't agree with you more. I have done that. I don't know that you could springboard straight from this into that kind of thing, but I can tell you that the American economy depends very seriously on immigrant labor and undocumented immigrant labor. This is particularly true in agriculture, especially in California. It's true in manufacturing in the Midwest. And what's going to happen if the policies that are being, the immigration policies that are currently being enacted in the US continue? A lot of people are going to figure out that this is not good for business. Because all that workforce will be gone. And young American kids don't want to do this anymore. You know, when I was a kid, it was no problem to work construction or sell shoes or do something like that. Now it's not common for young people to do that kind of work. Paul.
Yeah, super interesting. And I was, when you were talking, I was struck at how much of what you were saying about this rhetoric, entrepreneurship rhetoric, applies to non-profit sector or non-profit organisations, not just corporations, and not just in terms of what they are enterprising themselves to generate their own revenue. Even the way that a lot of non-profits talk about their employees, the terms and conditions, the types of contracts that they employ or engage with their people with. The parallels are really quite striking. So one of the really interesting things about this rhetoric you talked about is how it applies much broadly across the economy, not just.
But we talked about this a lot the other night, right? Right? And because he does social innovation. I was the founding editor of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and the reason I got out of it was because it became very clear to me after 2 years that what was going on here was an attempt by people with a lot of money to sell an efficiency employer rhetoric or an owner rhetoric, really, to the nonprofits that they gave money to. And as this became more and more, as social innovation became more and more prominent, this pressures became more and more significant, right? And I thought, the last thing I want is my nonprofit organizations to be run like General Motors. I don't want it. And certainly I don't want them run like, I don't know, what's Larry Ellison's company? Oracle. I definitely don't want to run like Oracle. So I agree with you 100%.
I was wondering if you could speculate, because I thought it was interesting about the rehabilitation of entrepreneurship rhetoric, and I was wondering what would need to happen for the entrepreneurship rhetoric of today to suffer a similar fate.
Well, I think the cracks are already there.
The cracks are already there.
Cracks are already there. And you can probably thank Elon Musk for this, for the cracks, right? At least in the US situation, you're beginning to hear more people say, wait a minute, what is Ellison, what is Musk, what is, what are the other guys that are running Uber, and why do they get a say? And they're really kind of screwing us over. And there's some argument about this in AI too, right? So there is something bubbling up, at least in the US, among, I don't know who they are, but you see it in the newspapers and you see it on TV and so on. There are people who are beginning to question whether or not these multi-billionaire entrepreneurs are any different than Leland Stanford and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, the guys who built the railroads and the banking industry, and how they accumulated wealth off the backs of other folks. nice labor relations argument off the backs of.
I think we're basically running out of time, so I want to give one more thank you to Steve for coming all the way from California.
Thank you.